and it is my great honor to introduce our distinguished guest today for this section, Polemics of Time and Space. Dr. Amin Jaffer is the International Director of Asian Art at Christie's London, with a particular responsibility for developing Christie's brand and business in India and among Indians globally. He specializes in Indian art in the age of European influence. For 13 years, a curator at the V&A Museum, London, Dr. Jaffer has authored a number of books, including Furniture from British India and Ceylon, Luxury Goods from India, and Made for Maharajas, a design diary of princely India. Dr. Jaffer is co-editor of Encounters, The Meeting of Asia and Europe, which explores the artistic and cultural encounter between Europe and Asia following the discovery of a sea route to India by Vasco da Gama in 1498. It accompanied the exhibition at the V&A Museum in 2004. Readers of Dawn newspaper will also know Dr. Jaffer from his Ad Buzz section, where he constantly delights and surprises us with his choices from the vault at Christie's, ranging from delicate French bureaus to David Hockney's. Dr. Dina Bangdel is an associate professor of art history at the Virginia Commonwealth University School of Arts in Doha. She specializes in Himalayan and South Asian art. Her primary areas of specialization are South Asian, Indian art, and Himalayan art, with secondary areas of interest relating to the issues of gender and identity in South Asian contemporary art and film. A native of Nepal, she has extensive experience traveling throughout Asia and has through the years worked closely with Nepalese scholars, ritual specialists, traditional craftsmen, and contemporary artists. Her current research focuses on the art and traditional ritual traditions of Buddhism in the Kathmandu Valley of Nepal and the development of Tantric Buddhist iconography of the Himalayan regions, principally Nepal and Tibet. She also served as co-curator in the exhibition on Tantric Buddhist art organized by the Los Angeles County Museum of Art and the Columbus Museum of Art in 2004. At VCU in Doha, Dr. Bangdel teaches courses on the art and architecture of South Asia, arts of Tibet and Nepal, contemporary arts of South Asia, and South Asian film. Welcome, and I'm going to hand this over now.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. Can you all hear me? Is that better? Wonderful. Thank you very much. This afternoon I'm going to be speaking a little bit about the cultural and artistic encounter between Europe and Asia, really starting with the discovery of a direct maritime route to Asia by Vasco da Gama in 1498. And of course, since antiquity, there has been the availability of Asian goods, East Asian and South Asian goods in the West, and indeed Western goods in the East. But typically, this involved a very slow, a series of slow overland and maritime routes. The result being that both the objects and the people who carried them were assimilated gradually into each successive local environment. And all of this changed very dramatically in 1453, when the Ottoman Turks seized Constantinople. They seized Istanbul, and they effectively blocked the Eastern Mediterranean. And what happened as a result of that is that Western Europe, which was emerging as a great economic force, all of a sudden found itself deprived of particularly spices, but all sorts of things from the East. But spices were one of the main things, of course, that were absolutely essential. Pepper, in particular, from the Malabar coast, absolutely essential in Western preserving of food and flavoring of food. And all of a sudden, these, what were considered to be fairly basic commodities for the elite, were no longer readily available. And there was, as a result of this, a need to have a direct link or direct sort of trading relationship with the people of at that time described as the Indies. Now, the role of finding the route, of course, came down to the Portuguese. They were sandwiched between a very muscular, growing and united Spain and the Atlantic. And so, of course, for the Portuguese, it was natural to look out to the Atlantic for expansion, which they did. They were colonizing successive small islands in the Atlantic. And in 1488 already had started to make great progress down the coast of Africa, had started to stop in at coastal stations. And then, of course, 1498, we really see a great moment in history, which is Vasco da Gama landing on this beach here in Calicut in present-day Kerala, India. Now, how did he get there? Well, of course, after he rounded the Cape of Good Hope and crawled up the east coast of Africa, he arrived in Malindi. And there he found a Gujarati merchant who was a pilot who taught him how to navigate the monsoon winds, and which you know are kind of awfully convenient for that whole Indian Ocean trade. It's all built on a very ready pattern of winds which carry vessels across twice a year. And Vasco da Gama, of course, finds himself in Calicut and lands. And this is really a great moment, because although when he lands in Calicut, among the first people that he meets are Europeans. He meets Europeans who are there. He meets Genoese and he meets Venetians, and he meets Europeans who have been in North Africa. The dominant language of the Indian Ocean trading world was Arabic, and he meets Europeans and he's quite surprised at them. But of course, these are Europeans who have traveled over years to the Indies and who are very indigenized in their language, in their dress, in their habits and customs. And the big difference with Vasco da Gama landing is that in abstract, a ship appears full of Portuguese, with Portuguese dress, weapons, food, etc., stocks, bang, in South Asia. And so it's an incredibly important moment and leads to a direct confrontation and a direct exchange at many levels. There's a diplomatic exchange, which is not very successful in the case of Vasco da Gama. There is a military exchange. It leads to misunderstanding, leads to warfare. And of course, there's an exchange in goods. There's a trade exchange that happens. Well, to understand the importance of the East, I think, to Europe at the time, we need only look at this cup. This is, of course, a coconut shell, which was so valued in 15th century Europe that it was extremely richly embellished and mounted. This is by a German goldsmith, probably I think about the 1470s, 1480s, extremely richly worked. Now, when Vasco da Gama, of course, lands in Calicut, the first thing he sees is coconut shells strewn everywhere. And although coconuts have a particular meaning for all coastal people, they don't have a very high monetary value. And this gives you an indication of how the moment a really banal object, a really banal thing, is taken out of context. The cultural and financial value it commands. So this is a kind of a work from nature, a piece of nature that arrives in Europe and is treated in a very heavenly way. And this is a work of man that arrives in Europe. This is the earliest documented piece of Chinese porcelain in Europe. It's known as the Fonthill vase. And we must remember, of course, that European ceramics were really very primitive compared to the ceramics of East Asia. Europeans were using, as vessels, very often wood. And the more advanced were sometimes stoneware and different types of earthenware, which were fired and decorated, but really in quite a rudimentary fashion compared to the very crisp and fine and highly decorated porcelain of China. And a vase like this, which would have traveled overland, this was made, we think, in about 1350 or so, traveled overland, arrived in the collection of the King of Hungary, and then it went into a papal collection. It then descended into the family of Louis XIV and had a great illustrious history because, of course, Europeans couldn't do anything remotely as fine as this for a very long time. Until the 18th century, they weren't able to achieve ceramics of this level. So there was an interest both, of course, in natural wonders, which included spices, of course, and works of man, such as these. And there was also a big interest in the West for the natural life of Asia. Asia was always associated with lions, always associated with lions and tigers and elephants and great, great, great beasts. What you have in front of you is a rather ungainly object. It's a stool made out of the bones of an elephant that was transported from Asia to Portugal as a present for the Queen of Portugal, soon after the discovery, and she gave it to her nephew, the Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian II. So it then traveled from Portugal overland into Bohemia, where along the way, of course, everybody from every city and every village came out to view this elephant. And it was the first elephant seen in those lands, in Bohemia, Austria, etc. And of course, when the elephant died, the emperor commemorated the life of the elephant by creating a stool out of its bones. And if you can see, the slide is not as good as it should be, but you can see that he has had inscribed on the different risers of the elephant coats of arms of his dynasty, as well as the life of the elephant has been engraved. There's a narrative history of the life of that elephant. It gives you a sense of the importance attached to this great rarity, this great rare beast, of course, which would have been known of from tales of Hannibal, etc., but never seen. Well, the first encounter that Europeans really had to conquer when they came to the East was the diplomatic encounter. And I don't know how many of you have studied the story of Vasco da Gama, but what happens when he arrives in Calicut is he arrives at the court of the ruler, and the first problem he has is that he has come with presents that are really paltry. He's come with some striped cloth, he's come with some casks of honey and oil, and I think that's about it. And particularly in South Asia, the importance of gift giving could not be underestimated in a diplomatic exchange. In advance of any diplomatic visit, the ambassador would send gifts, which would then be judged and assessed, and they had to, of course, be commensurate with the status of the kingdom he was representing. Vasco da Gama, when he landed, immediately boasted that he was a representative of the richest king in Christendom. And, of course, this didn't match up with the gifts, and so he was believed to be an imposter. He was thought to be a merchant who was trying to make a quick buck, and the doorkeepers, effectively, of the palace tell him that even the poorest merchant would give more than this when they come to see the king of Calicut. Of course, Vasco da Gama didn't know what to do. He didn't have anything to really offer. There was really nothing that Europe at that point could have given this very luxurious court. And, of course, he didn't have credentials. He didn't have written credentials. So he goes back to his ship and he fakes credentials. He makes them up. And, of course, they're discovered to be fake. So he's in a very embarrassed position. He's semi-imprisoned for a while. And what happens is a small skirmish, a small battle. And, of course, the Portuguese had superior military power, so they were quite okay. But the fact is that negotiating the diplomatic world of South Asia was a big problem. And we get a sense of this from the contemporary diaries of the period, such as those of Sir Thomas Robe. Some of you must have read at the court of Jahangir. This is a fabulous page from the Windsor Padshah-nama showing the life of Shah Jahan. And we don't actually know what is happening precisely in this scene, but what we can make out, of course, is that the emperor is seated in his Jaroka throne with his sons around him, with his courtiers, and outside the railings of the immediate precinct of the court, you have, on the right-hand side, a lineup of Europeans who are holding presentation gifts. And gift-giving was central in Mughal court life at every special occasion, at Nowruz, at birthdays, etc. Courtiers and noblemen were meant to give and to offer symbolically. They were offering themselves, effectively, to the emperor, and he, of course, reinforced the relationship by offering them in return robes of honor, or cloaked them within the mantle of his power. But the Robe diaries really indicate the problem that Europeans had in getting access to Indian courts, because they just had nothing that really interested. There was nothing that they could really give that mattered. What did matter, of course, was technology, Western science. This is an object which was made in Europe, made in Britain in about the 1790s, and it was given as a diplomatic court by an embassy from George III to the Qianlong Emperor. What was discovered very, very quickly was that it was, of course, Western astronomical knowledge, Western timekeeping knowledge, Western understanding of mechanics that really appealed to all the people of the East. And we've got to remember, for example, that in Japan or in parts of China, time was recorded using incense sticks or sundials, which were rather unsophisticated compared to Western clock mechanisms. So this, for example, is a combined telescope clock, and it's precisely the sort of thing that would have given a European an entry into an Asian court. And of course, the best gift you could have given anyone then was a gun. And when the Portuguese arrived in Japan, due to a storm by accident in the 1540s, of course, the thing that made the Japanese take them very seriously was their firearms and their weapons. And this is what was immediately recognized by all Asian people, who very quickly tried to appropriate that knowledge and that technology, both by hiring specialists from the West who could actually make guns and cannon, and of course soldiers, trained soldiers and mercenaries from the West who could train local troops in their use. So here we have a portrait of Shah Jahan holding a gun, and the metaphor is really very plain. It's very simple. He's standing on a globe, and it's really demonstrating how, with mastery of this technology, he is ruler of the world. And this ran across Asia. This is a Japanese manual from the 1550s or 1560s, which was a sort of how to use a gun. But obviously, you know, not very accurate. It's quite a stylized depiction of how to use a gun in full gallop. But the idea was that it was these wonders that came from the West that excited the people of the East. And this whole concept, my research in this area, which led to an exhibition at the V&A in 2004, was really driven by my annoyance with Edward Said's Orientalism book. And this is a type of screen which we call Namba Screens, made in Japan during the European period or immediately after Europeans were expelled from Japan in the 1630s, which really illustrate the Japanese fascination for Westerners as these exotic, semi-divine people, sometimes semi-divine, sometimes well, almost they were considered like goblins or monsters to some extent. So here is one of a pair of screens showing the arrival of a Portuguese boat into Japanese waters. And what's so interesting is that traditionally a Japanese screen really would have been read from right to left. And this is read from left to right in the European manner. It would probably have been made for a Japanese merchant, probably, you know, in the 1620s, 1630s. And the detail really betrays the extent to which the Japanese were fascinated by the Westerners who came to their ports. Part of it was that these big ships that they arrived in were akin to mythic treasure ships in Japanese, in the Japanese psyche. Here you have a Portuguese vessel arriving, you have the seamen playing with the rigging, a very, very sophisticated cargo being unloaded, which includes materials that came from all parts of Asia. We've got to remember that one of the things the Europeans did in Asia was they transshipped goods. So they brought to Japan Indian textiles, for example, or they brought to Southeast Asia Chinese ceramics. So you have the unloading of all of these goods onto the shore, and under this umbrella you have the Portuguese captain who is processing with all of the goods. He's meeting local Jesuits, local Christian missionaries who are there. The Portuguese, of course, came with a very strong religious mission. And here you have shops selling the wonderful exotic goods that the Portuguese brought with them. You see a tiger skin that probably came from South Asia. And in screens of this type, you often have representations of the Christian religion being practiced. So this sort of confection, this idea, this narrative of would have been commissioned and acquired by a Japanese. It's a screen, would have been used in a traditional domestic context as really a representation of the exotic world of these foreigners who came onto Japanese lands. Well, religion was a dominant part of this whole story. when Vasco da Gama arrived, when he landed in Calicut and he was asked what he was doing there, he said, "I come in search of Christians and spices." And one of the reasons was that there was a strong mythology in Christendom that there were Christian kings in the East. And this really came out of writings of the 14th and 15th century, the idea that there was a king called Prester John in the East, and that he was going to provide an eastern flank for Western Christianity, and that they were going to crush Muslim-dominated Holy Land. The two were going to get together, and they were going to crush that whole world. So, of course, the Portuguese came armed with this strong religious mission. They came armed with missionaries, and of course, you have with the establishment of the Jesuit order this strong concept of conversion. This is a remarkable Akbarnama painting showing the Emperor Akbar in dialogue, religious dialogue, and you have in the corner of the painting two Christian priests. We know quite a lot, of course, about Akbar's interest in eclecticism in religion and syncretic practice. But what is really exciting, I think the paintings are very well known, but what is less well known is the remarkable objects that were made at the Mughal court. Both for Christian practice there, because we've got to remember the Jesuits came and set up a chapel. They were invited to set up chapels at the various Mughal centers. And indeed, we know that the emperors, successive emperors, went to these chapels and they were quite delighted and interested in the iconography. They sometimes had the imagery replicated on palace walls, particularly related to the Virgin Mary. This is an exceptional thing. It's a jade ruby inset, a crucifix with cruets. Of course, it would have been used in liturgical Catholic liturgy. And of course, the symbolism of the ruby is the blood of Christ against the green. It was very, very strong, but superb quality works of art were being made. And here you have something from Japan. The Japanese were extremely skilled, of course, lacquer workers. Lacquer was a technique, a material very, very admired in Europe, but also extremely good at copying Western-style pictures. So this was probably made in Kyoto in a special art institute where the Jesuits and their own painters taught Japanese artists how to paint in a Western style. This is very early, you know, 1580s, 1590s, 1600, that type of thing. And of course, at the Mughal court, there was such a fascination for Western prints and Western images, and we know that from Akbar onwards, from his first direct encounter with the Portuguese in the 1580s, he really started to commission works of art to come from Europe for him, sculpture and painting. And then, of course, he wanted very much, both Akbar and Jahangir and Shah Jahan wanted European skilled craftsmen, designers, architects, goldsmiths to come to the court. And so we have immediately a dialogue between their techniques and practice and the local workshops. This is a superb painting of the Agony of St. Cecilia, based, of course, on a European Renaissance print. This is actually painted by a woman artist at the Mughal court in the harem of Jahangir. Really exceptional, shows really the mastery of perspective painting by Mughal artists. We know the admiration for Western art was very high. This is in the Victoria and Albert Museum. It's a miniature by Isaac Oliver, the English miniaturist. And we know from Sir Thomas Roe's accounts that, of course, he showed an English miniature to Jahangir, and Jahangir was, well, I suppose he was impressed by it, but he had, I think it was 8 copies made. And then Thomas Roe was asked to find choose which one was the original. So it gives you an idea of the extent to which Mughal miniaturists were brilliant, but they admired and clearly were attracted by the new ways of representation. This is, of course, a 3/4 facial view, which was really unknown in Mughal painting at the time. And of course, this culminates, these early encounters of the 16th century culminate in paintings like this. This is, of course, a 18th century late Mughal page showing mastery of probably painted in Jaipur, showing mastery of perspective and really taken to a great height. Well, on the other hand, of course, Europeans were fascinated by the exotic materials and techniques of Asia. And in the beginning, they had to do with what was naturally made in the East. So, for example, what you have here underneath all the gold is a Gujarati mother-of-pearl casket, completely overlaid with mother-of-pearl plaques. And we have a number of accounts of Europeans in Gujarat, in Ahmedabad, in places like that, all the way into Sindh, describing these mother-of-pearl inlaid and overlaid caskets. Well, this casket came probably through to Portugal and then ended up in Paris. Portugal was the big mart for exotic goods, and all of the kings of Europe who were collectors had agents there. This eventually came to the court of Francis I of France, who had his goldsmith, Pierre Mongeau, to set it in high French Renaissance goldsmiths' mounts, and these were done in 1532. So really, you know, very, very soon after the opening of a sea route. It's very interesting that the Louvre recently acquired this piece, and they describe it in their galleries as French. But of course, it's a completely South Asian object. But the fact is that the highest French goldsmith's work was reserved for these exotic works, these novelties that came from Asia. Over time, with the growing presence of Europeans in the East and with the understanding of the commercial opportunities of Asian craftsmanship, we have things like this being made. Completely European-style bureau of the 18th century, made probably in Canton, with a very cheap lacquer that looks quite showy. What's happened by this stage is, of course, European workshops in Canton and factors in Canton are able to galvanize local production into creating things that are tailor-made for the Western market. So we have over time this customization that takes place. The differing view of the world among the different, people of Asia and people of Europe is something of endless fascination. We know that the Chinese and Japanese were absolutely marveled, they were absolutely thrilled by Western globes. This was a big fascination. This is actually a globe made in China in the 1640s. And we have, under Jesuit instruction, we have a very strong sense. We always say, you know, China's closed. China's always been closed. But in actual fact, China, I wouldn't say was closed, but China was very selective historically about what they let in and what they don't let in. And they certainly let in Western technology very early on. And for example, the Chinese calendar was reformed by Jesuits in the 1640s. Gives you a real indication of the power of Western science. This is a Japanese example. The Japanese, again, were fascinated by Western cartography. And this is a double set of Japanese screens made based on a Dutch map of the world with all of the different people of the world represented. What is really fascinating about this map is that it was made and then the screens, the position of the screens were altered so that Japan wouldn't appear to be on the end of the world. Do you see? They put what becomes Alaska on the end screen. It would have been actually Japan on the end screen. And the Japanese immediately saw that they were at the edge of the world and reconfigured the world map. And this is a Maratha map. This is really fascinating. I'm going to see if I can get this pointer working. So this is a Maratha map, and this is a kind of traditional, you know, kind of Hindu cosmic view of the world. You then have what is an attempt to be a more naturalistic view of South Asia with various important rivers. And here down here you have Sri Lanka. This is supposed to be the Red Sea. And what's very interesting is that here you have these three blips. This is England, this is France, and this is other hat-wearing people, represented as this kind of lump. But the concept of the foreigner with the foreign attributes is really central to this whole story. And for the Japanese in particular, they took this to a new height. And a whole culture, Japan has always been obsessed by novelty. And it's been particularly city culture in Japan, Edo Japan, highly evolved creation of sophisticated luxury goods. And here we have one such example. It's a tiered food box. But what is created in lacquer, what's painted in lacquer is, of course, Portuguese. And what is particularly memorable about the Portuguese, of course, is their balloon-type trousers, their armor, and, of course, their long noses. This is something that is really very fascinating to the Japanese. And their hats, the fact that they're always wearing hats. Again, to demythify the Chinese, the story of China being closed. I'm showing you now one of a series of scroll paintings painted for the Qianlong Emperor, painted for the Qianlong Emperor probably in the 1770s. he had a curiosity about all the different people of the world. And 4 scrolls were painted for him showing different people, and these are obviously, as you can see, different people of Europe. And if we focus on detail, this is the British couple. And as you can see, the man is holding a bottle in his hand. So there was already a sense in 1770s China of the fondness for alcohol in British society, fondness for drink. And the text, of course, also reveals quite a lot about the British mercantile trade, the production of wool in Britain, and the wearing of wool in Britain. So already quite early, the concept of wearing the hat is really fascinating. Here is a miniature painting, which obviously is a love-making painting, Rajasthani painting, and the conceit of lovers pointing at the monsoon clouds, of course, is the classic one in Indian miniature painting. But of course, in this case, the man is a European, and although he's in a very romantic posture, he still has his hat on. And this is that whole concept of the topiwala and always wearing the hat is central. Of course, in India, in South Asia, Europeans were caricatured and mimicked. So you have a whole branch of painting like this in which they're shown to be senile or strange or demented. There's a very strong sense of their being, you know, childlike or very different. In Japan, although Europeans were viewed as semi-divine or mythic, personally, in terms of their appearance, their light skin, their clothes, they were quite looked down on. And this is obviously a Japanese caricature of a Japanese courtesan with a Dutchman. And you can see that she looks not very enchanted by her posture, and he's got very, very long nails, rather like talons, like claws, and she's had to light incense in the corner to mask his rancid scent. And these are the types of things. The smell of Europeans was a very big problem for the Japanese. Here we have another beautiful Japanese scroll painting. After Japan was closed to the West in 1639, the Dutch, who had no, of course, religious mission in Japan, they just were there to trade, were allowed to maintain a presence on a small island in Nagasaki harbor called Deshima. And here you have the Dutch men, they were all men, were allowed to mix with Japanese women, but provided they were courtesans. They could not mix with any Japanese women who were not in business, as it were. So this is a Japanese scroll painting showing these Europeans flirting with these Japanese courtesans. And of course, the Dutch are just speaking a type of gibberish. But through this period, even when Japan was firmly shut to outsiders in the 18th century, there were still channels for the absorption of Western scientific knowledge. So this is an 18th century Japanese translation of a Dutch medical treatise. Very, very strong sense of what could be successfully appropriated from the West. And this is nowhere better seen than in this scroll painting. This is a really magnificent picture. What you have in the background is a fire, a raging fire. And you have here a Confucian scholar, a Japanese scholar, and a European scholar, and they're debating how best to put out the fire. And of course, the Confucian scholar is probably urging, you know, buckets of water. It's the European scholar who's using a pump right here. And you can see how the Japanese is sitting next to the European scholar against the Confucian scholar. So it's really about, already in the 18th century, before Japan was open to the West, you know, if you've seen that terrible Tom Cruise movie about the samurai, this idea that Japan was closed, but it was closed at one level, but it was very open and clearly was siding with Western know-how. But it was not just know-how, it was also the exotic luxury productions of Europe. This is a fantastic thing. It's a Japanese robe, which is made out of French upholstery fabric. And you see a direct parallel here with a European woman's robe of the 1740s made out of a painted Chinese textile. And then once again, a Japanese undergarment made out of South Asian chintz, which was brought to Japan probably by Dutch traders. So you have this great intra-Asian trade, and you really have the beginnings of cosmopolitanism and globalism in the art exchange of the period. And you really see this captured in this reverse glass painting. what you have here is the Nawab of Awadh with his sons, painted by a British artist, Tilly Kettle. So Tilly Kettle paints this in oil on canvas. He's British, he travels to Lucknow, he paints it in oil on canvas, he then makes a print of it. The print then travels to China, where it is painted in reverse on glass, and that then comes back to Europe. So you have this toing and froing of motifs around this theme of the exotic, and I think that this is nowhere better seen than in this Japanese print, which shows Japanese people staring at Europeans and pointing at them. Here are the Europeans behind a typical Japanese screen. So this whole idea of the exotic other is a dominant thesis through all of this, that each culture found the other fascinating. But also look down in some ways on the other culture. This is a punch bowl made in Canton for export to Britain, and it's quite fascinating. For those of you who are interested in British art of the 18th century, you'll see that it's based on a print by Hogarth, and it's a print from the Rake's Progress, and it shows, it's called, I think, A Midnight Conversation, and it shows a bunch of drunk Brits completely making fools of themselves. They're so completely inebriated. This is one side of the bowl. And the other side of the bowl shows the Chinese drinking. And you see that although one of them has fallen asleep, it's a highly refined activity, the consumption in China. Well, of course, there was a common meeting ground. It wasn't that the other was just exotic. And certainly when we come to the presence of the Europeans in South Asia and in Southeast Asia, where you have a lot of intermarriage, you have a lot of exchange, although it was underpinned by commercial exchange, underpinned sometimes by political agenda, there were sometimes, and Willie Dalrymple spoke to us yesterday, sometimes real moments of meeting. This is a miniature which I absolutely love, showing an East India Company official sitting with a local Nawab. This is probably from Murshidabad from the 1760s. And what's so interesting is how the interior of this Haveli, or this sort of beautiful courtyarded house, traditionally would have been occupied by the family seated on the ground on bolsters and cushions. But of course, with the arrival of a European, everybody is suddenly sitting on chairs in this traditional environment. And the introduction of Western-style furniture to South Asia, something we all take now as perfectly normal, of course, was quite a dramatic thing when it happened. This is a portrait of a bibi, a girlfriend of a European, who is being portrayed on a Western-style chair, which must have been a kind of status symbol at some level. But of course, she can't sit in the Western manner. She can't have her legs hanging over. It would have been uncomfortable and possibly even rude. And so she's perched on it as if she's on the floor. But the interesting thing is that her hookah pipe is no longer long enough to reach the floor. So it's been elevated as well onto a candle stand. And then this is her boyfriend, who is doing the other. So while she's trying to use Western-style furniture, he's trying to indigenize himself, showing the soles of his feet very rudely, trying to balance, but he's shown very much as if he were a Nawab. You know, with the hookah, with the pandan, tukdan, he has the attendants with the morchals, with the chowries. So the idea of the exotic other really pervaded, I think, all aspects of Eastern life. This is one of a series of beauties of the Qianlong's court, and you can see that one of these beauties, so these would have been the most elevated women of the court of the Chinese Empire in the late 18th century, of course, is shown with a European table clock in the background. This was the height of fashionability. But it also goes one step further. It goes into cross-dressing and cultural cross-dressing. This is a portrait of a man called Captain John Foote, an Englishman who served in India, who came back home. We know from inventories of the British in India in the 18th century that they had very extensive wardrobes of local clothes. And here you have him wearing his jama and turban for a portrait by Sir Joshua Reynolds. And we have, by contrast, a fascinating image of somebody called Sakeddin Muhammad, who is, I think, originally Bengali, who comes to England in the late 18th century, and he opens up a Hindustani coffee house, he calls it, in London, and then he moves to Brighton and becomes completely indigenized. But the most exciting of all of these images is this one. For me, this is the Yongzheng Emperor, so, you know, early 18th century Chinese emperor. Why he would want to have himself depicted in a European wig with a cravat is really a fascinating question. And what we read into it is that in doing so, he was really establishing his mastery not only over his own domains, but also over foreign lands, showing how he was able to absorb and incorporate everything from around the world. And this is a very, very exciting image. This is the one of the mistresses, I think, of the Qianlong Emperor, and it's in the National Palace Museum in Taipei. And what's so fascinating is it's painted by a European artist or somebody working in an atelier of a European artist at the Chinese imperial court, and it shows this favorite of the emperor, who of course is a woman, dressed as the mistress of the King of France, Madame de Pompadour, the mistress of Louis XV. These were painted for, I think, for her chateau at Bellevue by Carl van Loo, and you have her painted as a Turkish sultana, you know, seated on the ground, wearing a kind of a hybrid dress with an African maidservant drinking coffee, another exotic product, on a porcelain cup, another exotic product, on what was considered a sofa, what was called a sofa at the time. So there's this feeling of, at the highest level of patronage, exoticizing oneself. I'm sorry, this image has come out terribly, but it's an image of Ghaziuddin Haidar, the Nawab of Awadh, who takes on the title of king in 1819. And of course, his endorsement of power came from the British, and because of that, he really begins to represent himself as a completely European sovereign. In doing this, of course, his dynasty ceases to refer to the Mughal emperor as a font of authority. They refer, in fact, to the King of England. And what's exciting about this miniature is you see the King of Awadh in the center of a dinner party. He's seated at a Western-style table. The table is dressed with a mixture of traditional South Asian and European imported paraphernalia, but he's wearing a pointed crown. He has the nimbus, which is carryover from Mughal paintings. He's wearing an ermine cloak, but he's seated in the center of the canvas almost like a Christ figure of a Last Supper. And what's really interesting is that his doorways have cornices with the double fish motif of Lucknow, and behind them are prints of horses. So it's a completely exoticized hybrid identity, not unlike that of a contemporary, the Prince Regent. So here you have the future George IV shown as a Mandarin, shown as a Chinese figure. This is a caricature, of course, of the Brighton Pavilion, and they're making fun of George IV's decadence and despotic tendencies, which is why he was likened to an Oriental ruler. This is one of a series of engravings of the famous Summer Palace complex outside Beijing, which was demolished in the 1860s. And this was built as a fantasy country estate, really, country park for the emperors of China. But you can see that they're modeled on European palace. The roofline is quite Chinese, but the palace itself, with the grand staircase and the waterworks, and it had a maze made out of hedges, etc., was all based on a Western conception, designed by Jesuits for the Qianlong Emperor. So not only was the imperial court cross-dressing, but they were also then creating Western-style buildings in order to kind of live a fantasy Western life, in the same way that the Prince Regent was building fantasy Chinese and Indian buildings. So the purpose of this dialogue is really to try and express how it doesn't matter which the culture is. The moment something is foreign, it assumes an exotic identity and an exotic role. And I'd like to close with this image, which is a very heavily loaded one. I think anybody who's been to the Victoria and Albert Museum has seen it. It's an image that I use to sort of close off this period, because after the British subjugation of South Asia, their perception of South Asia ceases to really be exotic in a positive sense. It starts to be seen exotic in a negative sense. But it's a very exciting image, of course, which is a demonstration of a metaphor for Tipu Sultan, the tiger of Mysore, attacking or mauling a British officer. And it shows the proposed defeat of the British by Tipu's forces. Of course, what's very interesting is that the tiger encases an organ of Western mechanical production. So it's an irony there. And of course, when you turn the handle, there's a particular tune comes out, and of course, the tiger mauls the European officer. I had the, of course, the irony, of course, is it was the British who defeated Tipu. I had the mixed privilege in her very senior years of taking Margaret Thatcher around this exhibition. What I'm showing you is basically images from an exhibition which I curated in 2004. And I took Margaret Thatcher around this exhibition when she was at the stage of not being always 100% there. But she was quite present at the very pivotal points in the exhibition. And when we came to this object, I said that this really represented the beginning of out-and-out colonialism in South Asia and the defeat of this concept of the British viewing India with quite a fascination for indigenous culture and taste, and it was the sort of the beginning of the end. And you know, it's all starts with the defeat of Tipu in 1799. And she said, "Please forgive me if I'm misreading this object, but what I see is a poor Englishman being mauled by an Indian tiger. And I'm sorry if we defended ourselves too well." But anyway, it was very, very interesting, having curated the show for so many years, to have this, you know, exactly the perspective I wasn't looking for thrust at me. But I hope that gives you a sense of, you know, the cultural exchanges that really develops out of this direct contact. You know, that although we had since antiquity a lot of exchange between Europe and Asia in goods and in people, the fact that it was an exchange that happened in a very, very measured and natural, organic way over time meant that a direct confrontation in a sense was averted. But post-1498 with Vasco da Gama, you have this direct face-to-face of objects, commodities, and people of totally different origin that leads to extraordinary works of art, and you can see extraordinary emotions behind them. Thank you.
Type of methodology that you're presenting for us as art historians, and appropriate then for the Lahore Literary Festival. What you're really doing is looking at objects as primary text, that objects tell a story, tell a particular narrative, and I think that is so critical in this particular theme that you're talking about. So three things that I really, that you mentioned that I picked up, and this is also my particular interest now in this construction of imagining the other. You know, how do, in this case, the East and West imagine each other in this absolute fascination. So what we have first is the whole idea of cosmopolitanism. And I think relevant to us where we are here in South Asia is, again, the Mughal courts. But throughout then, I think the Islam has been such a central focal point in bringing that sense of cosmopolitanism through maritime trade, and also language, absolutely. And in fact, you know, I live in Doha, and it's interesting that before the rial, they used rupees. So even in terms of the, you know, currency they're using, again, that's through trade. So really bringing together these very disparate cultures together through trade without the overlay then of politics that we see with, you know, colonialism. The other interesting aspect, again, is how objects become commodified, in the sense that your first slide that you showed of the coconut becomes luxury goods as an exotic other. And I think that, again, is absolutely fascinating about the life of the object itself. I was curious, again, to, you know, in your, this rich amalgamation of bringing together these objects from very disparate contexts, the process of literally being a detective and finding these objects and bringing together can you talk a little bit about that? Because that, I think, is the journey that makes it really exciting, but that's also probably the most difficult part of it. Because what you've shown us is the complete package.
Well, this is a really good question, and the answer may be a bit long. I had finished a book on furniture from British India, which was again a hybrid subject, and became quite fascinated with the idea of doing something pan-Asian. And I approached the director of the V&A about doing an exhibition on this subject, and we had in those days to present before a whole committee of people when you were a young curator and you had an idea. And there was only one curator on the panel. Everybody else was, the head of marketing, the head of press, the head of, the shop, the head of absolutely everything except really nobody who had any art background. And I gave this presentation, and the head of marketing said, reduce that into a soundbite. Give me like 5 words. What do you say? Of course, I couldn't do it. And then the head of, marketing or press or something said, nobody's interested in Asia these days. This was in London in 2002. And the director remained very, very quiet through all of this. And at the end, he said, this is exactly the type of thing that we should be doing. And we were very lucky to get sponsorship from Nomura, the Japanese who backed us. We had to find objects for this exhibition. And it was very tough because these are rare, isolated things, of a type that often fall between 2 stools. So my co-curator, Anna Jackson, and I really had to drive and fly around the world to the rarest collections and people and twist their arms and try and sell this concept. And we managed to bring together some quite wonderful things. But all along the way, the exhibition kept being contracted. And I remember once we were in Japan when we got an email from the head of exhibition saying, I'm afraid your budget's been cut by half, things like this. So my co-curator and I decided that we'd write a novel about 2 young curators on no budget, penurious, having this idea of doing this East-West show. Our design budget was slashed as well because everybody felt nobody was going to come to this exhibition because it was just too obscure and too abstract. Yeah. But in the end, the opposite was true.
Absolutely.
Partly because it was all very deeply grounded in humanity. It was all about one's own response, or anybody who had traveled, whether in the mind or in reality, was experiencing precisely the types of things reflected in these objects. But finding them was difficult. To get that coconut cup out of, or the earliest piece of Chinese porcelain, they were just never going to let out of that museum, which was it's in Ireland today.
I think the other part of it is the connections, the narrative that you put through. I mean, you can have a coconut cup, but then to say, okay, this is, what the context was, and through the lives in which it traveled. And I think that in itself, I find it absolutely fascinating. As you're talking about this, and you mentioned this term, I'm thinking of Homi Bhabha's idea of hybridity, that, somehow hybridity becomes such a sort of current term to use, but when you think about it, these objects are truly hybrid in the sense that they bring together, 2 disparate sort of identities into something that becomes on its own a whole new object. So I think that in itself to me is absolutely fascinating. Then you made a comment saying this was sort of in reaction to Edward Said's Orientalism, sort of this one-sided idea of not just the exoticizing of the other, but sort of victimizing and all of that. And I think this really balances it out very well. I didn't have any other comments. I know we are almost out of time, and I'd like to go ahead and open it up to questions from the audience. Absolutely fascinating. What a great journey. I think there's
Came to it, and in 1955, the site of Imperial College today on Exhibition Road was a four-story Indian museum, which was demolished. And those things were incorporated into the V&A with the promise that the V&A would get an Indian wing that never happened. So there's a bit of a national scandal. And then under Robert Skelton, there was the idea of actually then taking the collections to Bradford. There was this idea, and it's been a big disaster. I mean, the Nehru Gallery is a fine gallery, and now there's a Buddhism gallery, and in the forecourt there's antiquities. And the Islamic subcontinent is represented in the Nehru Gallery because it's very much driven by the Mughal dynasty, which leads on to the Jamil Islamic Gallery. But yeah, basically the collections are extraordinarily rich, and the space given to it is extraordinarily poor. I've worked, for many years, for 4 or 5 years of my life, every day, drudgery, in the storerooms of the V&A in Battersea. And for example, when John Irwin ran out of space in the 50s, the South Asian shoe collection was so extraordinary that he said, okay, let's just get rid of the left of every shoe, because they didn't have space. A lot has been over the years deaccessioned because of space issues. They would sell through local auction houses. Or like, for example, the V&A had a very good collection of silver howdahs. So they just melted the silver. They sold it. This was in the 20s and the 30s.
One shoe.
Sorry?
But they sold one shoe per pair?
No, that they just dumped. They just trashed it. But it's shocking. I mean, even in the 60s, when Victorianism was the height of bad taste, the V&A deaccessioned a lot of Victorian furniture because, nobody could understand the value of these things. Of course, by the 80s, they were having to buy exactly those same pieces back at high prices. So post-Raj, post the end of the Raj, there was an almost disgust with British Indian art, and particularly the hybrid things that turned me on were really considered to be the height of vulgarity and bad taste. So any attempt to get rid of that overcarved Bombay 19th century furniture was seized upon with relish.
So where are the Johnson albums now?
Oh, that's British Library. Oh, I mean, we mustn't confuse the fact. I mean, high court art was always revered and absolutely loved and taken care of. Nobody was getting rid of those things. It was the odd hybrid craft or things that were not purely South Asian. The big issue is the question of purity. So I think where Willie has done a lot of research, where I've done a lot of my research, were areas that 20 years ago nobody would have dreamt of really researching because they were considered to be impure. It's like bad taste periods. And in fact, they're fascinating. But the late Mughal paintings, the 1830s and 40s paintings, well, if you could have bought a Shah Jahan period painting, why would you be looking at it? That was the mentality. Now we understand their value in their own right. But it was the deaccessioning, and things were for the odd stuff. I mean, the great stuff was always considered to be great.
I think we have time for one more question.
Yeah. You mentioned in a miniature that you showed us that it was done by a woman at Jahangir's court. So could you tell us a little bit about these women artists? Who were they? How were they training?
I can't tell you very much. I think we need someone like Eva Koch, who's around, who's really, studied Mughal court life much more than I have. I'm in the end a generalist. But this was maybe Willie can talk about it a little bit.
I came across one specific reference in a letter from that whole Karanisa story in White Mughals, where when the granddaughter gets in touch with her grandmother, you have a granddaughter who's an evangelical Christian living in Torquay, trying to get in touch with her Hyderabadi Shia Muslim Begum grandmother. And this strange cross-cultural dialogue takes place. And the grandmother writes, I will get a woman artist to come into the harem and paint me. So obviously there were women they could access who did the paintings of the women. That's the implication.
In this case, she was called Nini, and the one who painted the Saint Cecilia. And from what I understand, she was quite a favorite artist by Jahangir, who recognized her qualities as an artist and made sure that she was properly trained and furnished with everything she needed. That we see the evolution of a culture of recognition for the craftsman to the stage where we know his name. But yeah, it's an issue. I mean, you have throughout South Asia and East Asia a strong folk tradition of very high-level works of art where we know nothing about the makers.
I was just going to piggyback on that comment, especially with East Asia. I mean, the whole idea of connoisseurship, appreciation of a work of art really doesn't come from the West, but it's ingrained. So you have, by the 5th, 6th century, how do you value a great work of art? So I think sometimes these East-West dichotomies become a little bit dangerous, to think about influences rather sort of neutral ways in which thinking processes happen.
I'd like to ask you to make a comment about space, South Asia.
Just wait for the